except it is not written in heavy dialect so that people can't understand the written word, but it is there. The dialect is completely there. So we're trying to tune this up, and I have another handout for you, and we'll get going because my life is not going to rise and fall on the PowerPoint, although I will be highly disappointed.
You're going to get it.
We're going to get it?
You're going to get it.
One of the things that most people don't realize, and the reason that I wanted to do this, is because I teach a lot of 111 classes, and I'm constantly telling my 111 classes who don't know anything to write that they can certainly spiff up their essays of remembered events or profiles or any other thing that they write. Would you like to hand out?
Sure.
Okay. So they can definitely spiff those things up, and even though you as a teacher don't necessarily want them to write something that's non-fiction, that's fiction. If you're doing a non-fiction essay, you have to face it as a teacher that you don't know whether they're telling the story straight or not. And one of the fun examples I have is having done a lot of oral history recordings. And I found out about 8 years ago that I had a knack for hearing voices, and that I could start constructing books just on the voices that I heard, and could translate those voices into a story. So I had a very dear friend who was 88 years old, and she was always telling me stories about the coast and how her family had lived on the Outer Banks, and they had struggled, and they went back after a big hurricane, and all of the bodies of their relatives had washed up, all the bones had washed up. She could remember a child going over in the sailing skiff and standing there with her parents as the undertaker went, and they gathered the bones that the hurricane had put on the shore. And she had this very vivid picture of that. And I'm thinking the whole time, I have to write this down. And I'm going to write it down the very way she's telling me. She remembered when graves were hand dug, and how she and her sister would go down to the graveyard and watch Lev, the grave digger, and that was his full-time job, dig the graves just so with one shovel. And the time that she and her sister went and Lev was not around, and they jumped down into the grave, and they were lucky that Lev came to save them because they couldn't get back up out of the grave, and how afraid they were. And Lev did come back, thank goodness, that day, and brought some rocks or whatever for the girls to get up on so he could bring them out of the open grave that he had dug. So interesting things that people tell you that you find fascinating can be turned into just about anything. So I did a book called Voices of the Crystal Coast, and my editor was saying, I want oral history. And I said, I know you want me to capture these oral voices, but they're so uninteresting in most books where you have Q, A, Q, A, Q, A. And you realize when you're interviewing people, and this goes to teaching profile, that when you're interviewing people, that you can have your questions really packed, and they can be in perfect chronological order. Because in profile writing, you don't do a whole lot of flashbacks. You don't teach those conventions in writing to 111 students. So the big thing is that if you're interviewing anyone, elderly people spring to mind, but it can be anyone, you'll go down to question 12, and they'll have a brainstorm and say, gosh, I forgot to tell you something that you asked me, and it could be question 2. And so suddenly you're all the way down here in the chronology, and you know that you're going to present a piece for a literary magazine. Maybe you've interviewed an author, and all of a sudden you have the problem of whether I take out this brainstorm that they had and stick to my questions, or am I going to tarnish the purity of this research recording and take this element and put it up here. So I have never had patience for getting any sort of structure out of my brain line if I thought a story should go a certain way. And I'm very lousy with flashbacks, by the way. I'm not the queen of flashbacks. So I took these elements and put them all into chronological order. because generally I interview somebody even for like a 5,000 word piece or 6,000 word piece. I could do probably 10 to 15 hours of interviews to get a piece that is that long. And then generally I'm calling them on the phone to also get some detail. How did you feel? What did you see? Trying to put some sensory detail in there to make the story a lot more interesting. And I realized, what I'm doing? I'm taking someone's oral history and I'm making it into an essay. But I'm keeping their voice. So I've done 2 books that way, and it's great practice and it's a lot of fun. So I said, let me take that a step farther. And I interviewed 200 gentlemen for a nonfiction book about swiftboat operations in Vietnam. And I went to Norfolk, Virginia to a swiftboat sailors reunion. I went to San Diego, California twice to a swiftboat sailors reunions. And of course the guys were very suspicious of me and what I would be doing with their material. They were not particularly forthcoming, even though my husband was one of them. But I did get several guys who were just really intrigued and gave me their phone numbers and their emails, and I could email them questions and talk to them on the phone. And I'm thinking I'm going to do this great Band of Brothers book, and it's going to be totally nonfiction. And it's going to capture what these guys were doing in the same way that Stephen Ambrose captured the soldiers and the Air Force gentlemen during World War II. And that was my whole image. In fact, I bought everything that Stephen Ambrose had ever written, which is another really positive thing for you, because the biggest public purchasers of books are writers, in case you don't. I guess teachers must be next. But every time I go to a writing conference, they say writers actually do most of the purchasing of books. So, of course, if you know there's a sort of something that you would like to write, then you can go forth by saying, okay, Stephen Ambrose has done something I would like to do, but I want to do it in another voice. But I want to see, how did he organize Band of Brothers? Why not go to that piece? Because he was a whole TV series. He made friends with everybody that was possible to make friends with in the movie business. And it made him famous. So you can go to success when you're thinking about what you're writing, what you're publishing, or what you're teaching. So I just pulled together some things, and there's a difference in turning nonfiction into fiction, 2 major categories. One is that you're going to do what you encourage students to do. You're going to have a notebook or a journal. You're going to observe. You're going to sit around and see great scenes and try to get your own sensory feel of what you're smelling, or the high puffy clouds that are going by, and the gentle lapping of the ocean. And those are very positive things to have in any sort of writing journal. Then you're going to listen to voices. And you may, one of the examples that I use is that I have a niece and her husband who are insane over Monday Night Football. I mean, they are so far gone that if Monday Night Football is on, and to be in their house when Monday Night Football is on is a total recreation of the football scene in Jerry Maguire, where the families gathered in front of the television set watching the guy that always says, "Show me the money." And they're sitting there and watching this guy on the field, and the family's just in all this motion and gesture and all sorts of guttural tones, and they're jumping up and down and slapping each other. Well, I thought, this is a scene out of that movie. And I now know that whoever wrote that screenplay could never have written that screenplay without having witnessed a scene like that. It came to me. And so you can book it when you see wonderful screenwriting, when you read wonderful passages in a novel, that if the strength is there, the sound is there, everything is there, that has been experienced some way or somehow, or someone has expressed that. And all you have to do sometimes, and this is very cheap, is to just turn the names to be different. You can almost write a full novel out of someone else's life because you're like a voyeur, recording things that you're seeing and responses that you're seeing from this person. That's how some people can write great novels when they've had their grandmother, who was a talker, in the family storyteller, and then it passed to the aunt or the mother, and a person who subsequently becomes a writer has absorbed all of these voices and all of these images and all of this detail because it truly is part of their lives. And they can actually sit down and write these stories themselves in some sort of order, whether they do perfect chronological order or they adapt into some flashbacks, and they can come up with what I call the bones of a novel. And then the big thing that's usually missing is some sort of arc or climax. And that's the hardest thing to develop in a long piece of fiction, is where you get to the turning point. We all know Agatha Christie, and her books go up like that, and then her main inspector character comes in, solves the mystery for us, and then the whole book goes wonk on. But most novels, you want a little bit more rise and a little bit smoother fall. You don't want to just fall off of the mountain there. When I do novel writing, I have a hard time with the climax. The climax has to sort of speak to me. Whereas there are some authors that can do a massive synopsis, meaning that they can, prior to fully writing the book, can do a synopsis of every chapter that they have developed or partially developed, and they can figure out their arc, or they can see their arc right within the synopses that they do on their individual chapters. And that fascinates me. But I have to write my brains out and keep tweaking and going on so that I can get an arc that I think people get, that they can see it. Especially since I've taught English 111 too much, because you all know when you teach a novel in English 111 and most of the students you have are straight out of high school, they may not have ever deconstructed anything. And they don't even know the definition of irony, and you're starting from the very beginning. And so I wrote this book because I can completely deconstruct it. And so I'll give you an example. The name of the book is Firefight. And we all know that in the modern convention of writing, if any of you are writing a novel, it's not going to sell unless the first chapter jumps straight off the page. And we are still teaching, if you're still teaching any sort of classical writing, or you're really immersed in teaching the classics, whether they be short stories or classic novels, the introductions are much more gentle. But it's a difference from what you're teaching and what actual publishers will publish, because they now have so many people who are younger than me who are editors. The last 3 editors I've had have been like 25 years old, maybe 24 to 27, and have master's degrees. And one had a master's degree in English from Columbia University. So the concept, if you end up being an experienced writer who has a little age on you, and you're getting an editor that's straight out of college, they are not going to correct all of your language either, by the way, because there is a whole concept now that writers have to be intelligent and literate. And the market is better than ever for people that have master's degrees in English. And it also helps your stock go up as far as being considered as a possible person to be published. Because editors do very much less editing than they used to do. One of my colleagues worked for St. Martin's Press for 28 years, and he resigned because he used to only have to edit 2 books a month. And so St. Martin's had him editing 7 books a month. And you know and I know just the labor of reading a book, much less going through and doing any sort of editing. And the job of a big-time editor is also one that goes in and helps you tweak your book. Like, they'll tell you this is awkward, this needs more detail, you need to develop this thought more. And often they have a suggestion that a writer doesn't follow. Therefore, that's the reason when you buy a book that you see typographical errors in the book.